welcome back to a Beautiful Disaster video, which I haven't done one of these for a while. Beautiful Disaster Day is Cop, which is a film from the 80s, stars James Woods, who's obviously very controversial in Twitterland, and directed by James B. Harris, who was the producing partner of Stanley Kubrick in the 50s and 60s. He moved on to make his own films at a certain point. As a director, like The Bedford Incident, Boiling Point in the 90s, he did a bunch of them. Cop's probably his most well-known film that he made. He made another one with James Woods called Fast Walking, like a few years earlier. But this was the one where Woods was actually a bit better known, so they could get a decent budget for this one. Wasn't that much, but it still didn't make any money. He came out and died instantly. And Woods went in to do more studio films after this. This one came out not long after Salvador had won some Oscar nominations, things. And Woods made this one, and he made Bestseller, which were both films that didn't do great, but they're both made by veteran directors who Woods liked working with. So Bestseller was John Flynn, and this one was James B. Harris. Now, the film was based on a James Ellroy novel called Blood and the Moon. There's a Lloyd Hopkins trilogy that I've read. I haven't read for a while, but I've read them. All about a kind of early cop in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And it's the kind of early Ellroy novels, in the sense that they're not quite He had yet to make his breakthrough with Black Dahlia, and he hadn't done his epic early confidential white jazz quadrilogy early quartet that he was going to write. So this is a writer early on learning how to write as himself. So these are kind of minor early novels of a guy who's going to get much better as we went on. So the film is based on novels. Ellroy wasn't a fan of the film, kind of disowned it. I kind of separate the film from the book. I always have this thing with films and books, is like the film has to work on its own. Doesn't matter what the book was, the film is important on its own. It has to be its own identity. Like, you can never really be the book. Every time people try it never works. It's better just to take, there's something in this book that's interesting, I'll try and do a film of this and make the film mine. So you've got two versions basically. You've got the book, you've got the film, and you can choose what one you like. Or if you might like both of them, you might like one of them, doesn't matter. And you just hope the person making the film has a clue why they are making the film. Which is in this case is true. They know why they're making the film. They know what interests them, they know what doesn't interest them. And that's what it's about. It's about what interests them in the book. So the film is about Lloyd Hopkins, who's a detective in the early area. He works for murder homicide department. He's the kind of person from the older group of detectives who had a way of doing things that was a bit more cavalier, and there's a new influx of religious detectives who have a much more conservative way of doing the job. But because Hopkins actually is a good detective, they can have to put up with him, but they know he's obsessive, he can go off the rails, he has to be watched out for, and I just can't wait to get rid of him because he's just annoying to deal with. But he knows his job. It's the problem. He knows his job. They know he knows his job. So in the first third of the film, you're actually getting to see all the Woods' characters. Good points and bad points. You're getting to get at the base of his character. As he starts to see there's a serial killer in the area that no one's spotted because the killer's changed his way of killing people over the years. So it's never the same way he does it. So it's hard to connect them. He does not do it all the time. He stops and starts. He's a reverend for why he does it and who he does it with and things, but it's his own mechanism. And the thing with the film is, it does not go into the killer that much. The killer's there to get caught. Who he is and why he's doing it is of interest, but it's not. It's more about the cop than the killer. It's all more about the psychology of the cop, and the killer basically becomes a shadow figure that only pops out really at the end, and the actor playing him is directed to play him in a way that you're never going to get why he did it. The same way, I mean, in most real life things, people get arrested, but no one's quite sure why, what set them off. A lot of time it's a mystery. It's just you've caught the person and put them in jail, and someone else can deal with them after that. And that's what this film takes, really, is we'll try to work out why they did it and what the connections are, but we don't care about your psychology, you just want rid of you. So James Woods plays a character who has a problem of violence against women. And as the film goes on, you start to get a sense of the reason why he hates them so much. He hates people who the rapists and murderers of women. The reason he hates them so much is he's a predator in himself. He has all those instincts in him, but he chooses to use it for good, but he's a womanizer. His way of dealing with women is not great. It's highly misogynistic in lots of ways, which the film is about. But, of course, nowadays Cos Woods is controversial, and it's now viewed as, it's an example of Woods being misogynistic. The film's obviously about misogyny. This lead character has those traits in him. He comes from a culture that is very macho and very male-based, and the view of women tends to be a kind of backing away from them in a way that's obviously kind of a bit fearful and a bit paranoid, and it's about that kind of psychology of someone who is interested in women but doesn't quite understand them, which what him and the killer share, because the killer has a fantasy view as one woman who he's focused on, which leads to the other killings, but he never really talks to that one person, and it creates a kind of fantasy illusion for her as well. Well, Woods wants to protect women, but he can't actually deal with them in real life. He wants to protect his own daughter and make sure she doesn't have fantasy illusions about how the world works by telling her all these horrible things he sees in his job, which freaks his wife out because why are you telling this little girl all this stuff? And in his view, he's trying to protect her from the horribleness of the world and horribleness of people and men like him. So it's his way of showing love, but it's also highly weird because it's not the way the world works. So we have that kind of drive for the character who is smart, articulate, but doesn't quite understand himself in lots of ways. But he understands there's something wrong with him, but he doesn't understand. He can't probe too much. But this killer does trigger him, because I think the thing about the film is it's showing there's something in his subconscious that he knows there's some connection with him. But it's not a literal plot connection, just the way he thinks there is a connection with him and the people he's hunting down. But he's not really going to shrink and talk about it. He's just trying to use his angst about the situation to catch these guys, because he knows it's a way of thinking that will lead to horrible violence. Because he has it, so he's going to use that to actually stop these guys. So it's like a guy who's a sicko who understands the sicko, but so he's very difficult to deal with, and he's very dangerous to deal with, because as the plot investigation goes on, he starts to interact with Leslie Ann Warren, who's a feminist author who was raped early on in her life, which is all down to misogyny, all down to people's feeling inadequacy around women who don't have interest in them. And her dealings with Woods is very destructive and very difficult. And Woods' character doesn't do much good there. He tries to be sympathetic, but he's also using her badly, and he uses her in a very brutal, horrible way in a lot of ways. Which just shows you his way of dealing with women is very dismissive, despite what he says and what he's about. So it's all about this kind of weird character who's sort of trapped in this weird psychological jail of his own making. He's no real interest in getting out of. He's kind of addicted to this drive of keeping doing this. So it's a problem character, but it's a fascinating character. He's not meant to be likable. He's meant to be a symptom of a certain generation that has problems in certain areas. This is who they are. They're trying not to be awful people, but they are in lots of ways because of how they're brought up and what's in them. And these are the causes and effects of their behaviour. So it's a fascinating film, but of course it was too realistic and too honest about dysfunction to ever have a chance. So when it was released, it got decent reviews, but not great ones. It was pretty much dismissed, and only certain critics like Kim Newman came out and praised it, and the rest just kind of ignored it. It was in the 80s where they were doing these cheese fest films and these, films with families and suburbia. This was a much more brutal, horrible, honest thing about what's going on in cities, and it was not well received. Nowadays it's better received because it was the start of a cycle that was going to go on. That and Manhunter would go on to Silence of the Lambs and all these other serial killer films. None of which were as good as the original early ones, because the other ones were about obsession rather than let's exploit the serial killer thing. The serial killer doesn't matter really. It's what they produce in the normal characters which is interesting. It's not them themselves. And later on, in these films, the reason why a lot of them are so boring is the normal characters are so tedious and so conservatively written in a sense that we don't want to suggest that these characters have anything wrong with them, or much wrong with them. They have an instinct to these characters, which is just a fictional way of saying, it's a safe way of saying we were evil in is, but let's not go into the evil. We'll blame the villains. We won't blame these other normal characters. We won't say why they have messed up. This film's much more like, yeah, we're messed up. We're all messed up. Which is never going to go down well with the public. It's going to go down well with a certain part, a small part of the public. So the film came out, bombed horribly, and it was another failure from James B. Harris commercially, because he never really did that well commercially, but his films always tended to do better later on, because they were interesting films. So it is one of those ones that's like, I adore this film because it is about a kind of crazy psychology, and it was done when Woods was at his peak as an actor, when he was really, we had no Twitter to rant to. He had projects where he could act in and get all of his angst out on the screen. He'd create all these fascinating characters in Videodrome, Once Upon a Time in America, this bestseller, Salvador, all these characters, and a lot of them were in films that probably felt kind of lefty at the time, which is funny because he is conservative, but it's like he was getting his angst out in all these crazy films at the time, and that was wonderful to watch. So Cop is definitely worth seeing. It's really wonderful, and it is about a kind of crazy psychology that applies to a lot of men. And it's also about the psychology of crazy, weird psychology that women put themselves through as well. The idea of, like, put yourself on a pedestal and not want to face some of the ugly truths of people, or having distance from it. And also, it's all about the emotional damage that happens with rapes, the emotional damage to people who are abandoned by their friends and who are just damaged. So it's about the damage on both sides, both male and female. But it is more interesting the male side because he's a detective, he's a cop. But it is about damage, generally with damage, which is an uncomfortable subject. So again, that's why it didn't do very well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. That's me for now. Again, as I said before, there'll be sporadic videos throughout the next month or two, but I'm not doing them the way I have been doing them over the Christmas period, because no one's really interested during this time. So hope you enjoyed them. I'll see you later. Bye.